The hum of the airplane cabin was a familiar comfort to Agent Jordan Carter. A seasoned FBI agent, he had spent years traveling across the country, blending into crowds, observing, analyzing. But today, he was just another passenger, just a man eager to return home after a grueling case. Or so he thought. "Excuse me, stewardess." A sharp voice cut through the quiet murmur of the cabin. "I don't feel comfortable sitting next to him." Jordan barely glanced up from his book before he felt it. The shift in energy, the tension crackling in the air like a live wire. A middle-aged woman, impeccably dressed in a tailored suit, was pointing directly at him. "Ma'am, is there a problem?" the flight attendant asked, her professionalism unwavering. "Yes, there is. I don't think he belongs here. Shouldn't he be in economy or something?" The woman's voice dripped with condescension, her eyes narrowing as she clutched her designer purse closer. A murmur of whispers rippled through the surrounding passengers. Jordan exhaled slowly, setting his book aside. He had dealt with situations like this before, but something told him this wouldn't end quickly. The flight attendant hesitated, clearly torn between protocol and placating the entitled passenger. "Sir, may I see your ticket?" she asked hesitantly. Jordan didn't answer right away. Instead, he reached into his pocket, pulling out something far more powerful than a boarding pass. His FBI badge gleamed under the cabin lights. And just like that, the woman froze. Everything was about to change. Jordan Carter had spent his life proving people wrong. Born and raised in Southside Chicago, he knew early on that the world wasn't always kind to people like him. His mother, a nurse who worked double shifts to keep food on the table, always told him, "You don't have to be twice as good, baby. Just never let them tell you who you are." That lesson carried him through life. It pushed him to excel in school, to outwork every expectation, and to earn his place at Quantico, where he graduated top of his class. Now, at 36, Jordan was a decorated FBI special agent specializing in criminal investigations and counterterrorism. He had spent over a decade tracking dangerous individuals, navigating high-stakes operations, and facing threats most people only saw in movies. But tonight, his battle wasn't against criminals. It was against something far more insidious, prejudice hidden beneath the polished veneer of civility. He was on a red-eye flight from Los Angeles to Washington, D.C., after closing a high-profile case. The exhaustion weighed on him, but he welcomed the quiet hum of the cabin, the rhythmic clicking of seatbelts, and the low murmurs of passengers settling in for the long flight. First class was sparsely occupied. Business executives, an older couple sipping champagne, a few scattered travelers catching up on emails or dozing off. Jordan had been upgraded at the last minute, a rare but welcome perk after spending months on the road. And then, of course, there was her. The woman who now eyed him with barely concealed disdain sat 2 seats away, her pearl earrings gleaming under the cabin lights. Everything about her screamed wealth and entitlement. The crisp designer suit, the expensive perfume, the way she clutched her purse as if proximity to Jordan would somehow diminish its worth. She hadn't even looked at him when she first sat down. But now she wanted him gone. Jordan clenched his jaw, forcing himself to remain calm. He had encountered people like her before, the kind who hid their biases behind polite smiles and coded language. "He doesn't belong here." He had heard those words in different forms his whole life. Normally he would have let it slide. Normally he wouldn't have cared. But tonight wasn't normal. Tonight he was tired. And tonight he wasn't going anywhere. The flight attendant stood uncertainly, caught between protocol and the discomfort unfolding before her. The murmurs of the surrounding passengers grew louder. Jordan knew he had a choice: let this play out or take control of the situation. His hand moved instinctively to his jacket pocket. All right then. If she wanted to question whether he belonged here, she was about to get her answer. The tension in the cabin thickened like a storm cloud ready to break. The woman's voice was sharp and dripping with indignation. "Excuse me, miss," she said, waving down the flight attendant with the practiced entitlement of someone used to getting her way. "I don't feel comfortable sitting next to him. Are there any other seats available?" The words hung in the air, heavy and unmistakable. A few heads turned, some passengers exchanging wary glances, while others pretended not to notice. Jordan exhaled slowly, keeping his expression neutral. He had dealt with this kind of thing before. On the job, in restaurants, even in airports where security had occasionally randomly selected him for extra screening. It was nothing new. But this time something inside him bristled. Maybe it was the exhaustion. Maybe it was the way the woman barely looked at him, as if he were an inconvenience rather than a person. Or maybe it was the simple fact that he was done letting people like her dictate the terms of his existence. The flight attendant shifted uncomfortably. She was young, early 20s at most, and clearly unsure of how to handle the situation. "I'm sorry, ma'am," she said hesitantly. "The flight is full. We can't move anyone unless there's a volunteer." The woman scoffed. "So you're saying I'm stuck here?" Her lips pursed as if the very thought was offensive. "I find that unacceptable. I know you have policies about this sort of thing." Jordan finally turned to her. His voice measured but firm. "And what sort of thing would that be, exactly?" She stiffened, eyes narrowing. "I shouldn't have to explain myself." The flight attendant swallowed hard, looking from the woman to Jordan, clearly weighing the consequences of her next words. Jordan could see the indecision in her posture. One wrong move and this could spiral into something bigger, something ugly. He had seen it happen before. The woman was already reaching for the call button, preparing to escalate, when Jordan decided enough was enough. With deliberate calm, he reached into his pocket and pulled out his wallet. The flash of gold and blue immediately silenced the conversation. The FBI badge gleamed under the cabin lights, the letters bold and unmistakable. Jordan flipped it open just enough for her, and anyone else watching, to see. He didn't have to say a word. The woman's face drained of color. Her mouth opened slightly as if to argue, but no sound came out. Her fingers clutched the armrest, her earlier confidence evaporating like mist under the sun. Jordan met her wide-eyed gaze with an unwavering stare. "Go ahead. Say something now." The flight attendant exhaled, relief washing over her face. The murmurs in the cabin shifted. A businessman in the row ahead smirked slightly. The woman stiffened, straightening in her seat. "I see." Her voice was quieter now, forced. "I suppose I'll just read my book." Jordan gave a slow nod. "Good choice." As he tucked his badge away, he felt it, the shift. The moment where the power dynamic changed, where the assumptions crumbled. But this wasn't over. Not yet. The plane hummed with quiet tension. Jordan knew the moment hadn't just passed. People were still processing it, replaying it in their minds. He could feel the occasional glance in his direction, some curious, others approving, and a few tinged with the same quiet disapproval that had fueled the woman's outburst. But he was used to it. He had spent his whole life proving he belonged in spaces where people like her thought he didn't. Jordan shifted in his seat, staring out the small window at the tarmac below. The sky stretched out in endless blue, a stark contrast to the storm brewing inside him. He could still hear her voice, the clipped insistence that she shouldn't have to explain herself, the casual way she had dismissed his very presence. It wasn't new. It was just another reminder. Across the aisle, an older man in a crisp business suit turned slightly. "That was impressive," he said in a low voice. Jordan glanced at him. "What was?" The man nodded toward Jordan's pocket, where his badge had disappeared. "The way you handled that. You didn't raise your voice, didn't lose your cool. That takes discipline." Jordan's jaw tightened slightly. Yeah, well, comes with the job. The man smiled knowingly. And I bet it's not the first time either. Jordan exhaled. Not even close. There was a beat of silence before the man extended a hand. Mark Whitmore, corporate attorney. Jordan shook it. His grip was firm but controlled. Jordan Matthews, special agent. I figured. That's not something you fake. Mark studied him for a moment. You know, I work with a lot of young guys trying to make their way up. Hard workers, sharp minds, but there's one thing I always tell them. It's not just about proving you deserve to be in the room. It's about making sure no one forgets you belong there. Jordan nodded slowly. That's the hard part. Mark chuckled. Yeah. But something tells me you're doing just fine. Jordan wanted to believe that. But the truth was, moments like this never stopped chipping away at you. He had spent years climbing, through the academy, through field training, through every test meant to break him. And yet, no matter how high he climbed, there was always someone like her waiting to remind him that, in their eyes, he'd never be enough. A lifetime of climbing. Jordan hadn't planned on becoming an FBI agent. Not at first. He had grown up in a neighborhood where the sound of sirens was as common as birdsong, where kids learned early which blocks to avoid, which streets belonged to which people. His father had been a firefighter, one of the good ones. The kind who showed up even when the fire was in the part of town others ignored. The kind who came home with soot in his hair and stories in his heart. You don't run from the fire, Jordan, he used to say. You run into it. But the fire that burned in their neighborhood wasn't always one that could be put out with water. Jordan had seen it up close. The way some people were written off before they even had a chance to fight. The way justice didn't always come evenly. That was why he had joined the Bureau. Not to wear a badge. Not to wield power. But to be a presence in rooms where people like him were rarely invited. And now here he was. Still proving. Still climbing. Set back in the skies. The plane was halfway through its flight when turbulence hit. It wasn't the kind that rattled a few drinks. It was the kind that made the whole cabin lurch, that sent stomachs dropping and gasps filling the air. Jordan immediately went on high alert, scanning faces, assessing reactions. Across the aisle, the woman who had tried to have him removed was gripping the armrests so hard her knuckles had turned white. Her lips were moving, whispering something, a prayer maybe. For the first time she looked small. Vulnerable. Jordan exhaled. He could ignore her. Let her sit in her fear the way she had tried to make him sit in discomfort. But he heard his father's voice again. You don't run from the fire, Jordan. You run into it. With a quiet sigh, he turned to her. It's going to be okay. She snapped her gaze to him, eyes wide. For a second, it seemed like she wanted to refuse his reassurance. But fear had a way of stripping away pretenses. Are you sure? She asked, her voice smaller than before. Jordan gave a small nod. Yeah. I've been through worse turbulence. Planes are built for this. The pilots know what they're doing. She swallowed hard, her breath shaky. For a moment they just sat there. Two people who had started this flight on opposite sides of an invisible line. The plane steadied. The worst of the turbulence passed. The woman exhaled. Thank you, she said quietly. Jordan didn't reply. He just nodded and turned back to the window. Because he knew that gratitude wasn't the same as change. But maybe, just maybe, it was a start. Conversation that matters. As the flight neared its end, Mark leaned toward Jordan again. You ever think about speaking to young recruits? Jordan frowned slightly. What do you mean? I mean, Mark said, people need to hear stories like yours. To see what it looks like when someone doesn't just beat the odds, but redefines them. You've got something to say, Agent Matthews. Jordan hesitated. He had never seen himself as someone who inspired others. He had spent so much time pushing forward, proving himself, that he had never stopped to think about who might be watching. But maybe Mark had a point. Maybe part of belonging wasn't just about showing up. Maybe it was about making sure others knew they could too. The descent. As the plane began its descent, Jordan glanced out the window, the city lights below sprawling in golden rivers. The woman beside him hadn't spoken again. She didn't need to. Some lessons didn't come from arguments. Some came from moments like these. When the world didn't bend to prejudice. When the person you underestimated turned out to be the one who kept you steady. When the climb didn't just feel like a burden, but like a reason to keep going. Jordan adjusted his tie, straightened his posture, and prepared to land. Because no matter how high he had climbed, he wasn't done yet. And maybe, just maybe, he was finally starting to see how much further he could go. The plane touched down smoothly, but the tension from earlier still lingered in the cabin like the last remnants of a storm. The seatbelt sign dinged off, and passengers instinctively reached for their belongings, eager to leave the confined space that had held more than just their bodies. It had held unspoken conflicts, quiet revelations, and subtle shifts in perception. Jordan remained seated, watching as the woman who had tried to have him removed hesitated before standing. Her movements were slower now, less sure than before. Maybe the turbulence had shaken something loose inside her that went beyond fear of flying. She turned slightly, her gaze flickering toward him. Their eyes met for a brief moment, just long enough for Jordan to see the uncertainty in hers. He waited. Was she going to say something? Apologize? Pretend none of it had happened? The air between them was thick with unspoken words. Then finally she took a breath. She stopped herself, swallowed, then tried again. I was wrong about you. Jordan studied her, searching for sincerity. She looked away. I don't know. I've never had to think about things like this before. Jordan nodded once. He could have said 1,000 things in that moment. Could have told her how exhausting it was, always having to prove himself, always being judged before he even opened his mouth. He could have made her feel the weight of all the moments like this that had come before. But he didn't. Instead he said, "Now you do." She blinked, then gave a small nod before hurrying off the plane. Jordan exhaled, rubbing a hand over his jaw. He wasn't sure if what had just happened counted as a victory. He wasn't sure if it meant anything. But then, as he stood to grab his bag, Mark clapped a hand on his shoulder. That, Mark said, was one hell of a thing to watch. Jordan let out a short laugh. Didn't feel like much. Mark shook his head. That's because you're too used to carrying this weight alone. But people like her. He gestured toward where the woman had disappeared. They don't change overnight. Starts with a crack. A moment that makes them see something they never had to before. And you just gave her that moment. Jordan let that sink in. It was easy to believe that moments like this didn't matter. That it wasn't enough. But maybe that was the real test. Not letting the weight of it all make him bitter. Not letting the fight for respect harden him into someone who only saw enemies. Maybe the real challenge wasn't just proving he belonged. Maybe it was making sure that, the next time someone like that woman encountered someone like him, they saw a man before they saw anything else. He adjusted his bag, squared his shoulders, and stepped off the plane. Because the fight wasn't over. But neither was he. Jordan stepped into the bustling airport terminal, the hum of travelers filling the space with life. He adjusted the strap of his bag, rolling his shoulders to shake off the weight of what had just happened. Mark walked beside him, hands stuffed into his pockets. "So," he said, breaking the silence. "What now?" Jordan exhaled. "Now. Go home. Get some sleep. And tomorrow, I go back to work like nothing happened." Mark shot him a knowing look. "You and I both know it's never like nothing happened." Jordan gave a half-smile. Mark wasn't wrong. Every encounter like this left something behind. Sometimes anger, sometimes exhaustion. But this time it was different. This time, he wasn't just carrying the weight of someone's prejudice. He was carrying the knowledge that maybe, just maybe, he'd change something. They walked in silence for a moment before Mark spoke again. "You handled that better than I would have." Jordan smirked. "That's because you don't have to handle it as often as I do." Mark let out a dry chuckle. "Fair point." They reached the baggage claim, where the crowd was already thick with people waiting for their suitcases. Jordan pulled out his phone to check his messages. Nothing urgent, just a text from his sister reminding him about their family dinner tomorrow. He smiled to himself. After the chaos of today, that sounded like exactly what he needed. Mark nudged him. "Heads up." Jordan looked up just in time to see the woman from the plane again. She was standing near the exit, shifting awkwardly on her feet like she was debating something. Then, with visible hesitation, she started toward him. "I should go," Mark said under his breath. "No," Jordan said. "Stay." He wasn't sure why, but he wanted a witness for whatever this was about to be. The woman stopped a few feet away. Up close, she looked different, less composed, more uncertain. "Listen," she started, folding her arms like she was trying to hold herself together. I just wanted to say, I think I owe you more than an apology." Jordan tilted his head slightly, waiting. She hesitated, glancing at Mark before returning her gaze to Jordan. "I grew up in a world where people like you, well, they weren't people I ever had to think about. Not really. And today, on that plane, I let fear control me. I assumed the worst. And I was wrong." Jordan's jaw tightened. He had heard apologies before, but this one felt different. She exhaled sharply. "You didn't have to be kind back there. You didn't have to be patient. But you were. And it made me realize how much I still don't know. How much I still get wrong." Jordan studied her, searching for any trace of insincerity. He found none. "I can't change the way I was raised overnight," she admitted. "But I can promise you that I'm going to try to do better. To be better." For the first time since they met, Jordan saw something real in her eyes, something beyond fear or entitlement. He saw understanding. He gave a slow nod. "That's all anyone can ask for." She opened her mouth as if to say something more, then thought better of it. Instead, she gave a small, grateful nod and turned to leave. Mark let out a low whistle once she was out of earshot. "Damn." Jordan huffed out a laugh. "Yeah. You think she meant all that?" Jordan considered it. "I think she's trying. And that's more than most." Mark nodded thoughtfully, then grinned. "You know, you should start charging for life lessons. You'd make a fortune." Jordan chuckled. "Maybe. But for now, I think I'll stick to my day job." His suitcase finally came around on the conveyor belt, and he grabbed it with one smooth motion. "You need a ride?" Mark asked. Jordan shook his head. "Nah, I'm good. My sister's on her way." They exchanged a firm handshake, and Mark clapped him on the shoulder before heading off. Jordan took a deep breath as he stepped outside into the cool evening air. The sky was streaked with the last traces of sunset, the world settling into night. As he waited for his sister, he found himself thinking about everything that had happened that day. The accusation, the doubt, the confrontation, the shift. It would have been easy to let it make him bitter, to let it add to the ever-growing pile of reasons to be angry at the world. But then he thought about the woman's last words. "I'm going to try to do better." And maybe, just maybe, that was enough. Because change didn't happen all at once. It started with small moments, quiet realizations. And today he had been part of one. As his sister's car pulled up, Jordan exhaled, letting go of the weight he had been carrying. Tomorrow would bring new battles, new tests, but for now he was going home. A month had passed since the incident on the plane, and Jordan hadn't given it much thought, until the email arrived. It was from the woman. "Jordan, I don't expect you to remember me, but I wanted to reach out. Ever since that flight, I've been reflecting on who I was in that moment, and who I want to be moving forward. I've started reading, listening, and having conversations I used to avoid. I even talked to my kids about what happened. They asked me if I was proud of how I acted that day. I wasn't. But I told them the truth, I'm learning. And I hope they will too. I don't know if this means anything to you, but I wanted you to know. That moment mattered. You mattered. Thank you. Jordan read the message twice. Then a third time. He wasn't naive. He knew change wasn't instant, that one experience didn't undo a lifetime of prejudice. But it was a start. A seed planted in a place he never expected. And that was enough. He closed his laptop, exhaling as he glanced out the window. The world outside kept moving, full of people going about their lives, making choices, facing their own turning points. Jordan knew he couldn't change the whole world. But today he had changed one person's. And that was a damn good start.